I think we're ready to get going. I'm Henry Emmons again. I'm an integrative psychiatrist, co-founder of Natural Mental Health. Quickly introduce the rest of our crew. Tim, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Dr. Tim Colbert. I'm an integrative developmental and behavioral pediatrician. I'll be talking with you tonight a little bit about helping to support your children and your teenagers.
And Amy?
Oh, it's my turn. Hey, folks. I'm Amy Prasek. I am here to support you in your program. So you know where you can find me. Reply to any of your emails or amy@naturalmentalhealth.com. So really happy you're here, everybody. Comment in the thread below for any questions that you have.
And I want to introduce our special guest, Carolyn Denton. Carolyn is a licensed nutritionist. Carolyn and I have been working together for over 20 years. We were teenagers when we started, and Carolyn, I do a lot of work, of course, with things like depression and anxiety. And so working with Carolyn has taught me a lot of things, but one is the power of good nutrition and really working with your body to get it aligned properly so that it has a chance to work the way that it's supposed to. So that's really what we want to focus on tonight is how do we work with our own bodies in a way that is really aligned with our own nature. And I say that kind of we're following through with the theme we started last week, which is kind of aligning with nature. And last week we focused on sleep. But this week we want to talk more about what can you do to really nourish yourself, to keep your mind and your body working as best it can. And I just want to really briefly introduce you to the concept that we use over and over in our work, and that is that we are not all built alike. We're not all the same when it comes to how our mind and body work. There's as many variations as there are people, but in practical terms, we find it really helpful to think about these three major subtypes, these three different ways that we have of approaching things, particularly with emotion and the way that our mind works and can get out of balance. And so the three subtypes really briefly, and if you're interested in exploring this in more detail, go to our website, take the questionnaires, learn more about what you're like when you are your natural, healthy self, well-balanced self, but also what happens when you get out of balance and what does that look like? So in general, the three types are those who, when they're stressed, they tend to get more anxious. And then there's others who, when they're stressed, they tend to get more agitated or angry. And then thirdly, when some people get more stressed, they get more sluggish and kind of shut down. So those are just really briefly the three different patterns. It actually makes a lot of difference when it comes to what do we choose to do for people, with remedies, natural therapies, diet, exercise, all of those things, even medications. So I'm going to toss this over to Carolyn here in a minute, but I just wanted to make an observation, and that is one of the things I have been surprised about in the first few weeks of this stay at home and the coronavirus taking over our world in some way. I really expected that most of us at this point would be really stressed, really anxious, not sleeping as much. And of course, that is happening for people. But my observation is that more people are like me right now, which is to be kind of sluggish, like tired all the time. I don't actually feel that stressed and anxious, but I am noticing how tired I am all the time. So Carolyn, I just wonder if you could talk us through that a little bit and what you recommend people do with whatever it is that's throwing them off balance.
Yeah, I'm with Henry. I really find with family and friends and clients that people are just feeling a little more removed, a little sluggish, a little tired. There is some fatigue probably from so much anxiety that you just cannot take so much in. And so part of what is happening because of that sluggishness is people are not necessarily hoarding food, but we have been doing that, pulling things in and craving sweets. We get out of our schedules and our routines. If you don't have to get up and get going in the morning, maybe you're not eating breakfast when you're supposed to or in a certain period of time, and that might run into, oh, now I've got to get online, and you forget to eat, and the day goes on, and then you begin to crave because you haven't eaten, and some people lose their appetite, some get more hungry. But one of the things that we can do, some of these, this sort of surface living, the sluggishness that we're experiencing, is when you think about the rhythm of how the body metabolizes, we burn most of our calories by about 3 in the afternoon. And we generally eat just the opposite of that. We have maybe hardly anything. We have a tiny little soup or salad. And then we have more food at the end of the day. And that is really kind of coming up against the natural rhythm of the body, and particularly now. If we don't eat, and maybe what would be ideal is to have a larger meal midday and then eat lighter in the evening. For this sluggishness, lightness in eating is better. So that maybe we have a sizable breakfast, big midday meal, and then a smaller later meal in the day. Because if we don't, what happens is we're operational. Our bodies are using calories, maybe pulling out of our muscles, which are making us more tired. And then by the time you eat, all of that food is going, that energy is going back to the morning or back to early afternoon and not forward. So we get this midday slump. And because we're out of energy, the message is, you should get something sweet, and so our bodies are craving carbohydrate. So part of what we want to do is, more than ever, think about the combinations of what we're eating, making sure that we have protein, fat, because that's very satiating, and complex carbohydrates like fruit and whole grain and legumes. Legumes, beans, lentils, chickpeas, those kinds of things, that's a light protein, but they're also a carbohydrate. So they're like a perfect food for this time where it gives you energy, but that protein is going to slow down the delivery of that. Things like sunflower seeds and pumpkin seeds, they're fatty, but they're not heavy. They're lighter protein and lighter fats. You want to, of course, really steer clear of simple sugar. That's going to bring you down for sure. And it's not to say that we can't have simple sugar. And I would say that part of the routine and structure should be, when am I going to have something sweet? When am I going to, eat, reward yourself for the day so that it doesn't spring on you later in the day where you can't, in a time where you're so hungry that you can't stop. We tease my dad because he's, well, and now it's proving to be quite useful for him, but he's quite a regimented man. He's 90 and he's been like this for his whole life. And one of the things he does is at 2 o'clock, he's 90, he has a small glass of wine and some peanuts. And that happens every day at 2 o'clock. And so I think part of what we want to do is go, here's when I have lunch. Here's what my lunch is going to look like. I'm going to have maybe not wine and peanuts at 2, but I'm going to have a snack, and I'm going to have, maybe I have dessert with lunch, so that your bigger midday meal and you have something sweet. You can allow yourself those treats because we need that. We need those pleasures as well.
So I know what Tim is going to take away from this. It's to have a glass of wine and some peanuts at 2 o'clock.
2 o'clock, yeah.
So Carolyn, one of the things that you and I were talking about earlier is that it's a little bit of an unusual time for being able to get the really good, healthy, fresh kind of fruits and vegetables that we might recommend for this? You know, when I think about eating for when I'm sluggish, I want to eat light, a lot of fresh foods, a lot of, you know, high water content. But right now, I also don't want to be running to the store every day or two.
Right.
So do you have some ideas for how people can still get really good nutrition without eating at their very best right now?
Right. It's something that I call assembly cooking. So there are a lot of jarred things out there. You know, like peppers and pickled things and cabbages and kimchi and frozen peas. I'm finding that I'm putting them in everything. And you can get a lot of really wonderful frozen vegetables. And what I always say is that, yes, fresh would be great, but frozen actually, usually they freeze vegetables very near where they've been picked. So they don't have a lot of time to lose their value nutritionally. So a frozen vegetable can actually be really useful, but there's a lot of jarred things and a lot of sauces and a lot of, you know, so that you're sort of throwing something together that's got a lot of color to it.
So when you say assembly cooking, because I think one of the other challenges right now is that things are getting a little boring. You know, we're eating the same thing over and over again. Again, it's just hard to go to the store as often. Most of us are not used to eating at home every meal of the day. Yeah. So if you have some ideas about that.
Yeah, so here's a recipe that would be simple pantry kind of cooking. Let's say you've got dried pasta, whatever form you eat, wheat or another grain pasta. You've got a jar of pesto. You've got some pre-cooked chicken sausages, and there's a million brands of those that you could have handy. They don't go, you know, they're already cooked, so they're useful. Maybe a jar of sun-dried tomatoes, some Kalamata olives, and you know that in maybe 12 minutes you've got this whole meal that's pesto and olives and these sun-dried tomatoes, and so you've got vegetables, and maybe you throw, you know, a handful of arugula in a bowl and you put some dressing on it, you know, so that you're not really putting a lot of time into it, but you've got a lot of color and you used things that you had at home.
Yeah, so thank you. That I'm going to do that tomorrow.
It's one of my standbys, my COVID standbys.
Yeah. So, you know, in the last few minutes we have here, I think it'd be great to talk a little bit more, because you do such a nice job with this, about how, well, really just how the stress response plays into all of this. Because even though many of us might be feeling, you know, a little low energy, sluggish, or what have you, one of the things I've learned is that no matter what imbalance you end up with, it's almost always driven by stress. That's what throws people off. So, you know, we have different ways of responding to that, but it is that kind of constant pushing on the stress button that tends to aggravate these things. So say a little bit, if you can, about how you think about what's happening even physiologically when the body goes into this stress reaction.
Well, the stress response is really designed to help us through an emergency. So the things that happen physiologically make really good sense if you happen to be being chased by a saber-toothed tiger. So, you know, blood pressure, heart rate, blood goes to your limbs and away from your core. But we also cannot concentrate when there's stress, because that part of the brain gets overridden. Our digestive system essentially shuts down, because you shouldn't be stopping to eat or really even going to the bathroom. So all of that shuts down. Because the body thinks you're fleeing, you also are burning up a ton of glucose, just thinking that you're fleeing or fighting, which that may or may not be happening, which is why movement and exercise during these times is so important, because if the body thinks you're fleeing, doing a little fleeing is very helpful. But other things that happen when we are under stress is the body gets more inflamed. So anything that is a vulnerability for the body, inflammation-wise, rises up and worsens. And then a really big important message is that to the brain, and that is, do not make serotonin right now, because that's for sleeping and for a nice calm mood. And if you were fleeing, really the very last thing you should be doing is resting or relaxing or going to sleep. You're the night watchman. So because all of those things are happening, and normally in a stress response, you get away or you fight, it resolves, but here we are. And when that stress pedal is being pushed constantly, all of those things are happening to some degree or the other.
Well, Carolyn, I know you have a personal practice and suggestion for what people can do to kind of turn down their stress response system. It's a really nice little acronym. So if you wouldn't mind sharing that and just kind of talking us through in these next few minutes, how can we apply this in our day-to-day lives right now?
Yeah, I think, for me, being able to sort of downshift out of that stress response, and for everybody, you have to do it manually because it's constant. That activation is constant. And so there are certainly, formal yoga, meditation, breath work. I tend to do things that are more like mindfulness in daily living. Like if I'm chopping up an onion, I just try and pay attention to chopping up an onion. But what I have found in these times is those things that I used to do aren't quite enough. And this tamer, TAMER plus nature, and it's on the website. I pulled together because it's sort of an expansion of all the, the gratitude practices and all the things that you do, what's going on, and trying to be aware of day to day. And so I put this together for myself so that I become, I'd have some awareness and in some ways acceptance of what's going on. And this is a way to reflect, which I think was really important for me. So tamer, the T, I ask myself, what am I thankful for today? And it can be something as simple as my kids are grown, so I don't have to homeschool them, or, really saying I'm healthy, or whatever it is. And it can be so many different things, but something that you're thankful for. The A stands for adaptation. And I think that is a very important thing for me. Trying to both, congratulate myself for making adjustments in my daily living. And that can be as simple as I've got to remember to wear a mask outside, or I can't, go out to the store every few minutes. And there's a lot of adaptation that's happening. M, of course, stands for movement. How did I move my body today? And that can be, resistance exercises that you do at home, classes online, there's so many, or just taking a nice walk. E is for a word, equanimity, staying even in times of stress. How did I stay calm? And that can be any number of things, the mindful practices, breathing, reading, writing. R stands for reaching out. Who did I reach out to? People are coming out of, people that I haven't heard from for so long are calling or texting or looking in on a neighbor, or anything that you can do of reaching out to somebody else. And then plus nature is really, how did I interact with nature today? And of course, as soon as it's not winter here anymore, that'll be easier. But it can be, I put seed in my bird feeder, so that I can sit and watch those birds, or uncovering a garden plot, or any number of things. And it has been really helpful for me. It's a very grounding thing that I do each day to help myself be present and be grateful. It's an expansion of that whole practice.
That's really nice. Thank you. So I'm going to see if I can remember it. It's thanks, adaptation, movement,
Mhm.
equanimity, reaching out, and then nature,
Right.
connecting with nature in some
Yeah.
meaningful way. Yeah, great things to try to incorporate into every single day.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you.
Any last suggestion about like if, anything else you'd want to toss out there for people to consider adding to their daily diet or their daily activities before we turn it over to Tim?
No. I guess I just, what you all talked about last week, I think it's really important to get to bed early and get up early. These are times when, if you don't have so much structure in that way, I think it's really important to follow the rhythm of light and dark right now. It
Mhm.
enlivens us. I found that anyway.
Great, thank you. Well, Tim,
I appreciated all that great information, Carolyn. Thank you so much. On the topic of stress in general, and I think, I'm seeing a lot of children these days via telehealth, and I would say also, you guys are right on. I'm seeing a lot of, pretty good coping in terms of anxiety and stress, actually, but I'm seeing a lot of boredom. I'm also seeing more irritability and annoyance kind of with their siblings, with their parents, because everybody has been in tight quarters. But in general, I would say these are all, let's say difficult sometimes or more intense emotions. And, when you think about our coping response and the way that we manage unpleasant emotions in any form, I do think that for a lot of us, one of the easy things to think about is the way that we tend to engage in somewhat subconscious activities. For example, I see myself pacing around the house. I see people biting their fingernails. I'll certainly sip on a glass of water or a cup of tea. I see people fidgeting with their hands and their feet. And so that's really interesting because I see all those things as some form of a self-calming response, as a way to kind of diffuse a lot of this negative energy, if you will, that people are experiencing. But I think it's important as well for both adults and kids to think about the fact that many of us also turn to food as an emotional response activity or behavior. And so I've heard more than a few parents talk to me in the last couple of weeks about their concerns about their child eating let's say a lot of junk food, or tending to want to snack more than just really eat meals. And I think that that does all fall into this category of what's called emotional eating, or some people call it stress eating. And it's an important topic because I do think that it's hard to know when to draw the line and when to kind of accept this as a normal variant given the situation that we're in, and when to really draw to the, I guess, a person's attention to actually try to change the behavior. And so I think that's an interesting topic these days. And I'm seeing a lot of kids basically, getting bored, and maybe it's driven by boredom as well, but I think stress eating and emotionally eating in a way that's probably not so healthy for them. One way I try to help parents understand this or differentiate it is to talk about the concept of physical hunger versus emotional hunger. And I think that that's useful, and you can talk to your kids about that. So with regard to physical hunger, that's a more normal, way to be eating. Number one, I think we know that a variety of foods can satisfy physical hunger. Number two, that tends to have more of a gradual onset, with you, and it can be postponed. It's not so urgent. Number three, eventually when you do eat in response to physical hunger, of course, then you feel full and you stop eating. And then finally, I think most of us don't feel guilty or any other negative emotion if we've had a good balanced meal. On the other hand, we think about emotional hunger, right? And I think that's a situation where you are not necessarily satisfied by a variety of foods, but you commonly, as you referred to, Carolyn, crave a specific food. I think those cravings are one thing to be aware of. For example, things like sugar or carbohydrates in particular, the potato chips and the pretzels and the cookies. And then secondly, oftentimes emotional hunger will strike us as being very urgent and sudden, as opposed to building more gradually. I think also the key here is that we then tend to eat beyond the time that we're full. We just, our eating is really not driven by hunger as much as it's driven by emotion, and we don't need the hunger. We just keep eating beyond what's reasonable. And then finally, oftentimes after you do emotionally eat or stress overeat, many times people feel guilty or embarrassed. And so I think it's good to differentiate too. And so for parents out there, I think there's a couple of basic things you can do to help to break the cycle, either with yourself or with your kids. And a couple of things to be aware of. I think number one, it really helps them to become more aware of it, bring it into conscious awareness. And one way you can do that is just do a simple food diary and a feelings diary for about 1 or 2 days. So I have the kids track what they're eating and when they're eating it, but as importantly, what are they feeling before, during, and after they're eating that item, either a meal or a snack? And just for a day or two, it's really revelatory for people as to how they can gain some insight into this. I think secondly, it's important to develop a variety of replacement activities that serve as a reset for your emotional system. And so, for example, if you can go out and exercise, it's all the things that basically Carolyn talked about in her tamer model, but you really want to reset your emotions, avoid the urge to emotionally eat. So exercise, meditate, listen to some music, play a game, talk with your friends and your family. And that's, I think, a really good way to start. And then finally, as Carolyn alluded to as well, be proactive about eating in a scheduled fashion. Eat 3 balanced meals every day. Have your kids do that and really work with them on that. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I have so many kids that skip breakfast. And if they're doing that consistently and having healthy snacks, they may avoid some of these urges to stress eat or overeat to begin with. So those are some of the things I think about in that stress eating situation. If the child is really doing this frequently, if it's one of their only coping mechanisms, they don't have a lot of good other emotional coping responses, then I think it is important to ask for help. So maybe you talk to your primary care provider, maybe you talk to a clinical nutritionist, maybe you talk to a mental health professional. But just a few tips to think about with this topic of emotional eating. And I think we probably have some time for questions. Carolyn, anything else you want to say about that topic, by the way?
No, I think that dovetails perfectly. Yeah, well said.
Well, we do have some time for questions. Thank you, Tim. So here's a question that I think any of us could take a crack at. I will start. The question is, what about caffeine for sluggishness? Is that going to help? I have given up coffee about a dozen times in the last 5 years, and I always come back to it. And last week, when we talked about sleep, I didn't really say this then, but when people are having trouble sleeping, in other words, because they can't sleep, they're having insomnia problems, I will usually advise them to gradually wean off the caffeine until either they start sleeping again well, or they're totally off the caffeine. And if you're of the mind body type like I am, where I'm pretty easily thrown off by things like stress or getting off schedule. So for me, caffeine, I have to be very careful with it because it can just add fuel to the fire really, really easily. But I am having no problem with using caffeine right now. And I actually really like my big, strong cup of pour over coffee in the morning. I'm not going to give it up right now. I think a little bit of caffeine at the right time of day, when you're not feeling like your nervous system is ramped up too much, can be, not only can it be just fine and well tolerated, but it might even be just a little bit helpful. What do you think, Carolyn?
Yeah, I would totally agree. And I think that when people are using caffeine midday, because they're tired and sluggish, they probably need to look at what came before. And very often it's that they're hungry, or they may have not had enough food earlier in the day. So the body's been borrowing energy out of the muscle bank. And so the message is, you need to do something. You need to maybe get something sweet, or maybe some caffeine. And so rather than doing the caffeine in the afternoon, to really maybe put in a mini meal, of like a black bean soup, or, something that's a little more substantial, and see if that doesn't do it.
Carolyn, I was going to ask you about this too. I know that you're sort of a non-traditional breakfast eater. You don't have, cereal or just oatmeal for breakfast very
Right.
often. And I notice you like to have a decent amount of protein with breakfast.
Mhm.
So, I mean, when you talk about a mini meal, do you mean having, all the different food groups even if it's a small amount?
Yes. Like, I think of like a mid-afternoon snack. I always like to have people think of it as a first course actually to dinner, something that you might serve as an hors d'oeuvre, or something that you might order in a restaurant previous to your meal, so that it is, like I said, a cup of black bean soup, or some cheese and olives and pickles and carrots and hummus, so that it's like a thing. There's a lot of flavor, but there's protein and fat and some energy. Yeah.
So here's maybe a follow-up question to that from someone. What foods can help give you a boost for sluggishness?
And I guess I would follow with that same thinking. We're feeling sluggish because the energy is gone out of our bodies, and so that whole front loading the day, eating about every 3 to 4 hours, especially now, because the body thinks we're fleeing. And so we're burning calories, or we're using up glucose faster. It's not necessarily, I'm burning calories. It's just the body's, operationally, and metabolism is on high alert. And so being able to bring in complex carbohydrates, fruit, whole grain, again, the legumes, is going to be really useful for sluggishness, because generally you're out of gas, you're out of energy.
So if let's just say it's 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I am really, really dragging, and I don't have something that's really prepared already. I just go to my fridge, go to my cupboard, and open it up and look. What could I look for that would be, I could just grab, that'd be super easy to eat, and still give me something like that?
Something like an apple with almond butter or peanut butter. Those are, and you can have a fair amount of that. That would be something that you could have right in your cupboards. Even a packet of tuna, if you had some tuna and you put something on it, and put it on some whole grain crackers, that would do it. That wouldn't take too long, but something that's a little, if you had yogurts, and even put frozen berries in there, and granola, some sunflower seeds, just to kind of make it pack a wallop, in terms of the variety of food in there. Would be some options.
Canned tuna we do have around the home. I think my wife thought it was gonna run out at the store.
Well, it seems like it should. It's perfect. It keeps forever.
Tim, here's a question for you. What age does emotional eating commonly start, and how can you open up the conversation with the kids?
Well, it's interesting. What some studies suggest is that kids are more likely to overeat when they're emotionally upset if they've actually experienced their parents using food as a reward with them at a younger age. And so I think be careful about that. Definitely, you can see, I think stress-related eating in particular, I've seen it more in, I'd say, middle school and teenage kids. And I think the issue about bringing it up is, an important one. I think you always want to bring it up gently and frame it maybe with or use a framework where you can comment on the child's healthy eating habits, the things they are doing well. And I think have some flexibility, in terms of, try to guide them about healthy food choices, and don't try to dictate healthy food choices to them. I think those are some of the important framework items to kind of get the conversation going. And as I mentioned before, one easy way to maybe improve awareness in general is just to start a 2 or 3 day food diary and use that as a way to begin this discussion in general. Carolyn, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I totally think that, that flexibility thing and having some options for something sweet, like the chia seed pudding or the chocolate avocado pudding, things that are really delicious, that can feel like a treat, that is built in, because they are experiencing the same things we are in terms of.
So where do I find the recipe for chocolate avocado pudding? That sounds pretty
It
good.
is online, of course, and I can actually, let's see, how would we get that to people? I
You can
have,
get it to Amy. We can post that, right?
yeah, I have both chia seed and chocolate avocado pudding. Do I have a time for a quick story about the chocolate avocado pudding?
Of course.
Okay, so we were doing a tasting at one of the YMCA's, because they had a kitchen that they wanted to promote. And we made chocolate avocado pudding. And this little guy, he was probably, I don't know, 7 or so. He came up to the tasting table for the chocolate avocado pudding, and then he would circle around and then come back to the chocolate avocado pudding. And he did that like, I don't know, 6 times. And then he said, "This is absolutely delicious." And it was like, oh my gosh, you're right, it is delicious. But it was as if he was like, "Oh, hi, you're a new customer." But he was really loving it.
That's great. So here's a question for both of you. Any supplements that can help curb emotional eating?
I guess with kids, a couple of things that I really like, if emotional eating is associated with high anxiety or kind of that feeling of agitation, and you don't know what else to do, I really like this supplement called L-theanine. It's a green tea extract, and the typical dose range is 50 to up to 200 milligrams a couple times a day. But that's a great one for, I think, smoothing out rough emotions and settling things down for about 6 hours at a time.
Yeah, and I would add to that, chromium and alpha lipoic acid. Those 2 supplements help insulin and glucose sort of balance one another. So if the craving or the emotional eating, the need to have something comes from dysregulation, those 2 supplements will help kind of bring that balance back a little bit.
I'll maybe toss in, because I've seen this also help people at times, to use a supplement that's really a serotonin support, kind of for similar reasons, because I think for some people, the craving for simple carbs is so strong because it causes a quick release of serotonin, not a lasting one, but a quick one. And so it gets a little addictive. So for some people, before the craving starts, if you do something to quickly boost your serotonin levels, such as a supplement with 5-HTP, a form of tryptophan, and magnesium, and a few B vitamins, it sometimes helps curb the craving a little bit.
Yeah.
So I love this question. This is really for all of us. What about self-compassion and just letting yourself have a day of not so great eating during this really difficult time? Is that such a bad idea? I'm not going to ask Tim because I know the answer Tim would give. What about you, Carol?
Why not?
Of course. I think, it's akin to, if we were having our normal lives, we'd be going out to dinner or celebrations, or we'd have holidays and we'd gather. And, gatherings are about food. You go to a baseball game and you have like so much food. And, so we have to build in the baseball game. We have to build in those times when you go, let's just whatever. And because it is not going to tip you over for long term, but it is somewhat of a, I mean, eating is pleasurable. It's very nourishing, not just because of the nutrients, but because of what it makes us feel like when we're, even when we're by ourselves, you know, to be able to celebrate. I think that seems perfectly fine.
Yeah, I think that it's really important that we find a balance, because we're suggesting, and I think this is a really good suggestion right now, that people really regiment their lives a little more, find more routine, you know, find, you know, get your sleep schedule really, really consistent, your eating schedule, all these things. And I think that.
Wine and peanuts at 2.
Pardon me?
Wine and peanuts at 2.
Yeah, exactly. And yet, I find that rigidity is always the enemy of good mental health. And so we've got to find that kind of soft balance between adding routine, schedule, even a little regimentation, and yet not doing it in a rigid way. So I think, you know, every once in a while, going for those chips or the cookie or the, you know, or just having a day where you say, okay, I'm just going to do whatever appeals to me today. I think it's probably a good antidote.
Yeah.
Once in a while.
Yeah.
Well, I think we are out of time. Carolyn, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes.
I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
How can people find you if they want to?
They can go to Partners in Resilience. My email and things are on there. I think that would be the quickest, easiest way, is just to go through Partners in Resilience and email me.
Awesome. Thanks again so much. And thanks everybody. Please join us next week. We're going to talk a little bit more about how the mind works next week.